as opposed to using it as like a loose insult. You want to define really the entire parameters and look at how it functions ideologically within a society. And the first thing I guess you want to look at is the widely accepted definitions of what racism and white supremacy, what those widely accepted or dictionary definitions basically are. And then look at what's problematic about those and how actually you could define the terms to properly frame the conversation about what you're actually trying to get at. Basically, the standard definitions, from my point of view, provide basically what I would say are ideological pillars to society. So they're basically liberal ideology that kind of reflect a racist and white supremacist ideology in and of themselves. So that the very definition, if you look at like the Oxford Dictionary definition or standard dictionary definition of what racism would define as a white supremacy, contained in those is, in my view, white supremacist and racist ideology. With regard to racism, there are two key aspects. The first is imposing of a definition that's suitable to the continuation of white supremacy and racist ideology. What you would define in the dictionary definition is things like prejudice, discrimination. Actually, I'll just read the definition. Prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against someone of a different race based on the belief that one's own race is superior. Okay, that's the dictionary definition. We'll come back to that. A second problem is the imposing of basis of race as a concept, specifically deviating from a conception of race as applied to a large number or varying groups of people, ideally understood as, basically arbitrary or often baseless in general in terms of scientific or biological relevance. And then taking that concept and, shifted it into like basically small groups of racial categories. And if you look, what these usually was kind of like based on either like a colorism or a Eurocentric view where you have black, white, and then Asian or African, basically European, and like Asian groups, which would include like natives in like the Americas, for example, would be fall under the category of Asian. And then, white, obviously, in European, and black, obviously, in the African region. Okay. So first, let's deal with the dictionary definitions of white supremacy and racism. I mean, the first thing that you'll notice if you're kind of witty, sharp, when you look at it and you're really thinking about it and you're really trying to analyze what's going on, is just you'll notice the terms, concepts related include prejudice, discrimination, and basically what is bigotry, basically. Okay, that's included within the concept or within the dictionary definition. And if you notice even further, the implications that arise out of using the terminology like that. Okay, if you take for example like racial prejudice, to be like a little bit more specific, it's now revealed that a concept of racism is being presupposed within that definition. Okay, you understand that, right? I'll explain it basically. If I say racial prejudice, okay, so prejudice is included within the definition of racism. So basically what you're getting here is a circular definition. Okay. If I just say prejudice, I don't have to be talking about prejudice against just race. You be prejudiced against, for example, women or something like that, okay? But when you add that into the definition of racism, but race has to be presupposed because you're talking about racial prejudice because it's racism. You see what I mean? That's extremely problematic because one presupposes the other. For you to be prejudiced to be racist, well, race as a concept already has to exist. You already have to have some conception of racism to then be prejudiced. And obviously that doesn't include, like, for example, women or often they don't want it to include religious groups, even though and it sort of could. But I mean, like, for example, like tall people or fat people, you'd be prejudiced against, a fat person, or discriminatory would be better. Discriminatory against a tall person, fat person, short person, a person you perceive as dumb or smart. Maybe, heck, how they're dressed, what kind of clothes that they're wearing, they may smell funny. I mean, there's tons of things that you could be discriminatory against other than racial categories. Okay, so that's why that's problematic. And I mean, it's obviously not a good definition. And if we just take it let's take it, if we take the classic meaning of ism as pertaining to an action or ideological quality, basically, together with race, that could result in the overall meaning of racism, basically. So as of or related to a particular conception or conceptualization of race. And that is what needs basically a deliberation as far as understanding race and how you want to frame the conversation. The latter part leads basically into the second of the key aspects. But before I address that, and continue to provide the definition of racism relevant to setting the parameters for debate, I first need to address the supporting features of the dictionary definition, besides, as I already implied, by what was just discussed, the deliberate ignoring of how race is functioning as an ideological concept, which obviously wouldn't even approach the impact. By defining racism in terms of bigotry, prejudice, etc., one can actually detract from one's own complicity and support for ideology, a racist ideology of and a white supremacy, in the form of conscious or unconscious adherence or sentiments or beliefs, and perpetuation of the system by simply, like I said, denying, the former, right? So what I mean by that is, like, go back to what I said originally about someone just saying, well, I'm not a racist, I'm not a white supremacist, just denying the fact, right? But just by denying that, they can cover up for if they even have those type of feelings, right? And they could also cover up for the perpetuation of a system based on racism and white supremacy, which will make sense once I actually lay out, what racism, white supremacy represent and how they function. That'll make a little bit more sense at that point. Let me move on. An understanding and insertion of the concept and ideology of white supremacy into the conversation is important. So that's the one we'll talk about next. In the case of white supremacy, with regard to the conceptions of race, which provide the foundations of contemporary racism, and thus serve as a basis for the definition of racism relevant to defining the terms of the conversation through the descriptive term itself, it is seen that a theory of race is already presupposed, as is the case with racism. So like I said, when you say white supremacy, okay, the term white is in there. Okay, white is obviously a certain conception that applies to race. So already when you say white supremacy, you're presupposing a specific conception of race. And that's really what you want to get down to, is there's particular or specific conception within the contemporary framework of race, a particular understanding that is the groundwork, is the foundation, is the philosophical, basically, well, not really philosophical, but ideological groundwork for a conception of race that goes into these other concepts of supremacy, prejudice, discrimination. And that the adherence to that is, or the support for that is the racism, or if you're racist, is supporting that and perpetuating that ideology or conception of race and the certain structures in society also that are developed off of this, and basically white supremacy. So let me move on. By definition, by the definition of white supremacy, as the establishment of, okay, I'm going to give the definition now. The definition of white supremacy as the establishment of associated social, cultural, political, economic, and obviously you can continue through the spheres of society, of a dominance and superiority, which is rather understood as self-evidently from the terms themselves, like I already mentioned. And one of the many concepts co-opted by the dictionary definition of racism, along with bigotry, one can see the importance of the establishment of a race-based ideology that normalizes white as an aggregation of various groups that could apply under a more expansive or simply differing perspective. Okay, so what I mean by this is that to support whiteness, basically, when you hear about people talk about whiteness, you have to throw away, and that's what I'm talking about earlier. You have to throw away a conception of racism that likes to divide, and this is what they did after World War II. If you look at, and I'll post it up there, but you could see for a long time that they used to describe color in like a census records. And then once you get to like 1950 and 60, they changed it from color to race. Like it's no longer color. I think one year it might have been color or race, but then they changed it to race. And one thing they did do, if you look at specifically the UN report on racism, I think it was 1950, when they basically had a commission put together where they was going to study racism and try to kind of like alleviate a lot of these problems. What they wanted to move away from, or what they called a race myth, was this conception of race based on just dividing into different groups that had differences. So, for example, Italians, or if you take like Catholics, generally like Irish or Italians, or you want to take Arabs, or you want to take Jews, for example, or certain Africans, blacks, Caribbean, Jamaicans, whatever type of groups, as far as you want to do it, even to nationalities, English, French, British, like I mentioned with Italian and the Irish, they wanted to move away from that, or they saw that as problematic. But what they lay out is specifically what I mentioned earlier, which is the categories such as white, black, or Asian, or I think what they put in there, I can't remember if they used like Caucasoid, Negroid, or Mongoloid, or something like Mongolian, Caucasian, Negro, as black, basically black, white, and Asian, as their basis for like a biological understanding or anthropological understanding of it, of a division. And often when you get into conversations with people, they'll do that. You'll notice that people will do that. Like, they'll say something, like say Muslims or something, say Islam or something is not a race, or Arab isn't a race, or if you say like this person is like Nigerian or something, that's not a race, they're black, or this person's white. You'll see those get thrown out within just daily or conversation, or within like an argument, maybe online or something about racism, or you'll see that conception of race that was laid out there got normalized in society, and you could see how that was needed, or that would have been needed, to consolidate all these other separate groups. I mean, if you got Italians, Irish, Jewish, German, French, English, Americans, all kind of seeing themselves as different and not being able to fall underneath this conception, it kind of makes it a little bit more difficult for white supremacy, because you need, because like I said, it presupposes the concept. It presupposes that there's this whiteness. If there's not this whiteness, then there's not the supremacy. You can't have it. Because, I mean, obviously, if they have a problem with Jews, they don't see them, or Catholics, or all these other people. You're getting a really just tiny group of people. And it's not white supremacy at that point. And another thing that is probably often overlooked, but it's really a great point, is that when you talk about it, white supremacy, you're really not talking about white supremacy, as far as it's not European. They're the specific group that pushes this ideology, if you really want to look into it, is, or who actually have the global like elite dominance in the world, obviously the most powerful nation is the United States, which came from Great Britain and England. And those ideas, if you track history and philosophy, you'll notice that ideas from people like maybe like John Locke or Hume or Adam Smith or John Stuart Mill or other political economists and other philosophers. If you want to look at the founding fathers of the United States, for example, those ideas obviously, which was laid out into the Constitution, still have a huge impact on the ideology of thinking of people today. So those ideas were of an English tradition. If you look at the way the U.S. government was set up, it was out of an English tradition, English common law. And basically, I mean, there's a lot of people who, from that region of the world, who fought. I mean, it was a British colony before they set up the United States. So I mean, that's very important. And if you look at like some of the elites, the Rothschilds, for example, in banking, were obviously Jewish, or considered themselves Jewish. But I'm not going to get into that. I'm not going to get into the whole Jewish thing here. But as far as these specific groups, there was those groups, and obviously if you look at Jewish representation, or what they call Jewish representation in Hollywood or something like that, it was those main groups that have controls over the narratives in society and of the basically those pillars of society that would fall under the category of white supremacy. I mean, it wasn't German, for example, or Germany or France or Spain that ended up setting the groundwork for what white supremacy and what white culture is and was today. It was the British mainly. So I want to move on now. I think I got enough of that. But basically, as described above with racism, defined by the dictionary definition, white supremacy also becomes problematic, like I said, when viewed as a level of personal sentiment with belief or, ignorance of a wider ideological ramifications of functioning within a social and politically economic context. Like I mentioned with racism, when you personalize it, when you try to say that a particular person is racist, or you try to look, even if you try to look at like a system, but you don't look at it from the right context, it becomes problematic. And that's why it's important. And that's what I'm going to get into next. With both, basically, there's a masking of the above mentioned underlying conceptions or the foundational race to white supremacy, the foundational conception of race to white supremacy is representing the key ideological aspects of racism, like I mentioned. In addition to dealing with the topic, and it's like it's obfuscating basically, and the objectivity and the properly understanding of the actualization of it within society, and the subjective, basically, as well as objective dynamics and their totality are missed. So that's what I want to talk about next. Is the objectification and actualization of racism and white supremacy in society today.